global economic conditions have been volatile. Higher tariffs on imports into the United States have been announced and then partly reversed. US assets have sold off, while alternative safe havens such as gold and the euro have performed well. The combination of higher trade barriers plus elevated uncertainty is likely to weaken the world economy. We have therefore lowered our global growth projections. Prospects for global inflation are more complex. The United States could experience higher inflation from tariffs and supply chain disruptions. Those supply chain problems could also raise prices in other economies. At the same time, inflation could be lower given weaker world growth, cheaper oil, and abundant capacity in economies like China. Given these conditions, we see global interest rates slightly lower this year. The US Federal Reserve has kept rates unchanged recently, but other major central banks, such as the Bank of England and the European Central Bank, have cut their policy rates. Turning to South Africa, we do not yet have the official data for growth in the first quarter. However, the indicators for sectors like mining and manufacturing have been disappointing and unemployment has risen. In our last meeting, we warned of downside risks to our growth forecasts. We have now trimmed our GDP projections and expect growth of 1.2% this year, rising to 1.8% by 2027. The outlook for structural reforms remains positive, but there are also headwinds like lower global growth. Given the lower forecast, we assess the risks to growth as balanced. Moving to prices, inflation was below 3% again in April. The undershoot of the target mainly reflects falling fuel costs, but underlying inflation is also well contained. Core inflation came in at 3% at the bottom of our target range. Looking forward, we have revised down our inflation forecasts. This reflects the lower starting point as well as a stronger exchange rate assumption and lower world oil prices. These factors offset pressure on fuel costs from the higher fuel levy announced in the budget. In addition, our previous forecast included VAT increases, which have since been cancelled. We see balanced risks to this forecast. The threat of rand depreciation that we warned of at our last meeting, given both global and domestic factors, manifested last month, with the currency briefly touching a multi-year low against the US dollar. But the exchange rate has since recovered and conditions seem more settled than they did in March, even if the global environment remains uncertain. Against this backdrop, the MPC decided to reduce the policy rate by 25 basis points with effect from the 30th of May. 5 members favored this action, while 1 preferred a cut of 50 basis points. While the inflation outlook appears benign, we considered an adverse scenario which illustrates the upside risks. This was based on a global slowdown triggered by escalating trade tensions where the rand depreciates sharply. The scenario showed how a country with some fundamental vulnerabilities like South Africa risks stagflation, with growth moving lower while inflation rises due to currency weakness. In these conditions, monetary policy tightens to stabilize the macro economy. In this meeting, We also considered a scenario with a 3% inflation objective, which corresponds to the low end of our target range. For some years now, internal and external analysis has shown that our inflation target is too high and too wide. The National Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank have engaged extensively on this issue, and technical work is at an advanced stage. Now that inflation has slowed, we have a chance to lock in lower inflation at low cost. This scenario illustrates that opportunity. For a 3% objective, our quarterly projection model shows a lower path for interest rates. Both our baseline and the 3% scenario have a cut in this quarter. However, rates move steadily lower in this scenario as inflation comes down. The policy rate falls to just under 6% rather than staying above 7% as in the baseline. Inflation expectations stabilize at 3% during 2026, helped by the experience of lower inflation. Growth is somewhat slower at first because real rates are initially higher. But the economy does better later in the forecast as rates ease further. The MPC is of the view that the 3% scenario is more attractive than the 4.5% baseline, and we would like to see inflation expectations move lower towards the bottom end of our target range. We will also consider scenarios with a 3% objective at our future meetings. The global environment remains difficult, which makes domestic reform critical for achieving healthy growth. The SARB's main contribution is to deliver price stability, and we see scope to lock in low inflation and clear the way for sustainably lower interest rates. Additional measures that would improve economic conditions include reaching a prudent public debt level, further repairing and strengthening network industries, lowering administered price inflation, and keeping real wage growth in line with productivity gains. That concludes our statement. And at this stage, we would like to give you an opportunity to ask questions, to direct the questions to me, and we will then see who amongst us responds to the questions. As usual, please identify yourself and the media house you represent.
Jana Marx from Business Day. I have a question with regards to the target band. Deputy Governor Fundi Chazibana at the pre-budget briefing, she referenced alignment with our trading partners. So I'm wondering which international models or benchmarks are informing the SARB's analysis or consultation process with the Treasury?
Is that the only question? Anything online?
Nothing, Governor.
Okay.
Oh.
Good afternoon. My name is Ndando Tugwana from Bloomberg News. My question is around the inflation target and the work that's being done to revise it. Just how much work still needs to be done to get consensus, especially on the side of Treasury and the Finance Minister? Thank you very much.
We have another hand here.
Still on that, Governor, my name is Muluko Mloto from ENCA. I just want to understand the timelines that you're having in place, but also if you were to simplify how this is going to affect South African consumers going forward.
Okay. Jana, you wanted to know which international benchmarks. today, we will release a summary of the inflation targeting conference that we had in Cape Town that marked 25 years of inflation targeting in South Africa. Accompanying that summary will also be a working paper produced by the staff of the Reserve Bank. In addition to that, there are papers that were commissioned by the Treasury and additional papers that were done by various other staff of the South African Reserve Bank. It's comprehensive. Just to put you at ease, to say to you, the advanced economies are targeting 2%. If we look at the emerging market universe and we take the median inflation target, the median inflation target for the emerging market countries is 3%. And when many emerging markets have revised their targets, and some not so developed but not emerging markets had also revised their targets, we can't find any country that had revised their target higher except one. And that one country is New Zealand. And that's because they used to have a target range of 0 to 2%. And they revised the target from 0 to 2% to 1 to 3%. Everyone else had revised the target lower. But you set international benchmarks. Let's benchmark ourselves against ourselves. We introduced an inflation target of 3 to 6. We revised it to 3 to 5. And there was an agreement that once we reach 3 to 5, we will take the target to 2 to 4. But it was considered too risky to announce the 2 to 4 at that time, and 3 to 5 got announced. We got hit by an international shock that took the inflation outside of the target. If you asked what the policy mistake of the time was, the policy mistake of the time was to decide to revert back to 3 to 6 instead of sticking with the 3 to 5 and say we have experienced a shock. Instead of us achieving the 3 to 5 in 2004 as expected, we will achieve it later. And what then, if you read Minister Manuel's statement, said, at an appropriate time, we will revert to the 3 to 5% target. Manuel left, Mboweni left, the appropriate time never arrived. That is us. So the work was done then. We have not decided what target we'd adopt because the team is still doing the work. They must come and recommend to the minister and the governor and say this is the appropriate target. Muluko, not Ntando, said what work must still be done. Much of the heavy technical work had been done. What should be the optimum inflation target? What sacrifices would we have to deal with? How do we manage those sacrifices? All of that work has been done, the benchmarking, the comparisons, all that work had been done. You've got to get to the mechanics. How do you move from the one target to the other? If you have agreed, how do you move? What's the transition? Over what period of time do you do that? Is it only going to be achieved via monetary policy, or do you need other policies in government to also be recalibrated to the new inflation target? And then, of course, there are administered price setters. Those administered price setters at the moment, they seem to be setting their price at some margin above the inflation target. If you lower the target and they keep the margin, that means that they are going to then have to adjust their prices at a lower inflation rate than previously. Or even better, if everybody had bought into the new target, that they would then think that their prices should be adjusted in accordance with a new lower target. So for now, the teams must do their work and make the recommendation. The work is at an advanced stage. That's what I would say to you. Moluko, what effect would this have on South Africans? It is something that we had to grapple with, because sometimes the narrative that had been dominant had been that if you are to achieve a lower inflation rate consistent with a lower target, you are going to need higher interest rates. This argument just baffles me. I cannot think of any country that targets a 2% inflation that has got interest rates like the ones we are having. They are having lower interest rates. Even the countries that are targeting 3% are having lower interest rates. Let's get the drift. The higher the inflation, the higher the interest rates are going to be needed to deal with that high inflation, because what you have is that you have the entire economy resetting itself or setting itself as a high inflation economy. So today the scenario that we presented of a lower, what would happen? That is what, because when we do these scenarios, we have got to look at the nature of the shock that we might have to deal with. And at the moment we said, given where inflation is, with the most recent print being just under 3, given where inflation is, if we were aiming for a lower target, what would interest rates look like over the next 3 years? So you wanted to know how will South African consumers benefit? It depends if they are borrowers or savers, but we are mainly borrowers. If you look at that scenario says that we will have actually lower interest rates, which means that borrowers will benefit from lower interest rates. But that is because the ordinary person thinks of these things in nominal terms and not in real terms. And the question that people will then often have to come down to, in the scenario we say that instead of the 7% that we are talking about, that 7% is what economists will call the nominal rate in steady state. That's where we would actually be getting to. How did we arrive at that 7%? That 7% is simply the inflation target plus the neutral interest rate in steady state. What is that neutral real interest rate? That neutral real interest rate is the interest rate at which monetary policy does not stimulate the economy and neither does it contract the economy to try and rein in inflation. Put to its simplest stories. A lower target will bring structurally lower interest rates. If you get it. So it will lock in lower interest rates going forward. And South Africa would be a low inflation, low interest rate country. That is the borrowers. They are not the only players in the economy. They are investors and so forth. And what the scenario shows is that you actually end up with higher growth over the forecast horizon. And higher growth will benefit the entire economy, but a growing economy should also be an economy that creates jobs, which means that we would be making progress to dealing with the job creation challenge. So In a nutshell, that is how the thing would be. It would be if it was not just a scenario and we had adopted a lower target. We haven't yet. Yes, those are all the questions, and I was wondering where she is today. Kopan.
Good afternoon, Governor and Deputy Governors. A few questions. Firstly, in these uncertain times where we know there's a lot of trade instability, or trade uncertainty, I should say, what do you view as the more pressing role of the SARB? Would you consider it to be fighting inflation or supporting economic growth? And in that vein, do you consider this 25 basis point cut as serving the support of the economy? So why not a 50 basis point cut, for example? Then, I think that's like question 3. If the Rand resilience were to continue, is there room for a front-loaded rate strategy cut or rate cut strategy, especially under your 3% inflation scenario? And then, lastly, this cut, would you still consider that rates are in restrictive territory, given this cut and your previous response on real neutral rates and where we are right now? Thank you.
Alistair.
Governor Alistair Ball from Bloomberg. Thanks very much for taking our questions. Just a quick one. How do you assess the inflationary impact of the proposed increase in the fuel levies? I imagine your staff have modelled it. How much do you see it adding to price pressures if it is in fact enacted? Thank you.
Okay. Kopano, the uncertainty is here with us. And since April, I have attended in total no less than 5 international either conferences or sessions on the global economy and on monetary policy. And the titles vary, but they have got one name in them: uncertainty. It's either navigating the global economy in the era of uncertainty, or the challenges of monetary policy in the era of uncertainty, or the challenge of this and the era of uncertainty. So I had come to the conclusion, the one thing that is certain is that uncertainty is here with us. That is the one certainty we have. And you say, what is the role of the SARB? They are uncertain. The most important thing is to stay true to your mandate. And our mandate is price stability in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. It doesn't say, is this or the other. It is understood that you cannot have balanced and sustainable growth unless you have price stability. And it is very important for the Reserve Bank to stay true to that mandate of price stability. Yes. And you then ask the question as to whether in this instance the move that has been taken had been taken to support growth or to fight inflation. Well, we have assessed the risks to the outlook. We expect that inflation will average 3%, 3.2% this year. And we were saying, in the alternative scenario, if the scenario was a scenario of targeting 3% rather than 4.5%, that outcome would have been 3%. And going forward over the next 2 years, inflation is within target and is below or at 4.5% in our baseline scenario. In the alternative, the inflation is closer to 3. And guess what? You actually have lower rates in the alternative scenario than in the baseline scenario. And that is the message. High inflation begets high interest rates. If you want lower interest rates, you must have lower inflation. Rand resilience and future rate cuts, we don't target the exchange rate. We target inflation. And we had highlighted how in the previous meeting we talked about the uncertainty around the rand. And that uncertainty and the risk of the depreciation of the rand visited us. It had since reversed and the currency has strengthened. But look carefully. The currency has strengthened against the dollar, but it had weakened against the pound and the euro. So it's not so much just that the rand had become stronger. It is also that the dollar has become weaker. There are things going for us that we have been able to deal with some of our own idiosyncratic uncertainties. That helps, but there is also the story of the dollar that is weak. So, if you're looking for one variable that will drive the future trajectory of interest rates, look at the inflation and where inflation is going. Don't go and pick the exchange rate or the output gap, or don't do that. Look at where we are going with respect to inflation. Do we still believe that monetary policy is restrictive? As it stands, where we think is the terminal rate is more like 7% that we had talked about, and that is our baseline. We are at 7.25 now. That is very close, and that might be a rounding off error, and that's the space that we. So we have reduced the extent of restrictiveness. We are not as restrictive as we were in the previous meeting. And then, of course, we did talk about the alternative scenario. What would it have looked like in the alternative scenario? Again, you can look at that. I have spelled that out. Alistair, the impact of the fuel levy is in the forecast. There were compensatory factors. The increase in the fuel levy, which was basically inflation related, it was not above inflation, would have then meant that it slows down fuel price disinflation. But we also stated at the previous meeting that the VAT increase will lead to a rise in inflation. That has been taken off. So there are things that had set off against each other, and besides, we had a lower inflation starting point, and in a way, you had the fuel levy, but you also had a lower oil price and a stronger exchange rate, which basically means that the motorists still came out better than otherwise would have been. Zianda?
Thank you, Governor. I have some questions from Hilary Joffe at Business Day. Is there political support for a change to the inflation target? What indication do you have from Finance Minister that he can take government along with him on this? Closing that question, would the SARB go ahead with the lower inflation target even without the Treasury signing off on this? The next questions are from Colin Gonko at Reuters. What matrix is the SARB using to track progress on structural reforms? Are we now officially in an easing cycle? Thank you, Governor.
Okay. Somebody attended the launch of Operation Vulindlela and briefed the MPC about the performance. We do not use any other matrix other than the ones that we get from OV, but who has an appetite for the structural reform thing? Oh, Chris, you are volunteering. Great. You can deal with that. And then, do we have a political support? Hillary, we've said we have instructed the teams to do work, and work is at an advanced stage, and recommendations would be made to the minister and the governor. How the minister gets support from government, that is exactly why you have got technocrats doing the technical analysis and the political leader having to make the political decisions, and that's what you would have. Would SARB go it alone? Of course we can go it alone. Will we do it? We do not think it is desirable. Inflation targets work because you have got the entire government behind those targets, because you need more than monetary policy to achieve those targets. You have got to deploy the other policies to deal with inflation. As things stand, South Africans cry about the high cost of living. And listening to the discussions over the past 2 days, this was brought up repeatedly about what steps is government taking to alleviate the high cost of living. And the high cost of living, once you say high cost of living, that means it has reached a level. You will not be able to bring it down. It's there. It's locked. The only thing you have control of is the rate at which the cost of living goes up. That's where the central bank comes in. Because our job is to maintain low and stable inflation so that you do not have the cost of living rising too fast and eroding the purchasing power of the incomes of South Africans. That is where we come in. Are we officially on the easing cycle? I thought I had answered that before, but DG Kasim, with your skill of a teacher, if you could deal with that answer.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess firstly, it's very hard to talk about a cycle. If it turns out that at a few successive meetings we have cut or have tightened, that turns out, but we don't, premeditate that we're in a cycle, partly because of the uncertainty and the nature of things moving very, very fluidly. It could be very different if you're in a more kind of stable environment. But I think that where we are now is, if you look at the criteria for the last few cuts, given the risks we faced, our aim was to be less restrictive. And I think we're now more or less at this neutral zone, given all the imperfections about how you measure these things. So that's where we are. Needless to say, we repeat this going forward. Look at the data. We have a forecast. We'll see what happens to our forecast, and we'll see what some of the balance of risk, downside or upside will be. But that's where we are. None of us are thinking about a cycle as such. Thank you very much.
Rovald.
Thanks. So on OV, I think the takeaway here is just simply that we're very confident that energy, transport, water, visas are all really appropriate targets for government action to alleviate constraints in the economy. you will see from our GDP forecast that we have GDP rising. We've had GDP rising for some time, so we're confident that these sets of reforms are going to generate stronger growth. Having said that, we've seen some pretty bad GDP outcomes in recent quarters, and we would like to see much stronger private sector investment on the back of the OV reforms and driven by other factors, including a pickup in the economy generally. So there's movement that we'd like to see there, and the faster it happens, the faster we'll get to much stronger growth rates. But the targets are all there and going in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That concludes the proceedings of today. We will see you in July.
No.